Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is my post-season review or reaction to how well Haas stacked up throughout this season. How did they stack up to my preseason, rating? How did they stack up to my in-season rating? How did they stack up to the rest of the field in this regard? So without further ado, we will see here that on this nice little chart that they ended up officially in 10th position, dead last. Now, in my preseason prediction, I had them all the way up into 7th position. Now, due to the preseason testing that I saw, I was thinking that they were doing pretty well, and I figured that they were going to continue that development on that Haas so that they would be able to at least maintain those positions, if not gain a little bit of ground. Now, I was totally off on that prediction. As you can see, they started off well, and then they could not really maintain that position, and in fact started dropping back down to the back of the pack. Now, for my in-season rating of 9th, how I ended up with that score was that I took the team members of Haas and rated them between 1 and 10 for each race throughout the season, and then took the average of those driver ratings, which gave me a score of 5.61, which compared to the other teams put them in 9th. So a little bit better than the official standings, but definitely worse than my preseason predictions. So how did Haas do? Well, they started off decently, and then they kind of ended up, faltering and kind of falling behind the rest of the pack and not being able to really maintain those positions in that good air that they started off the season with. So without further ado, we will kind of look at the Nico Hülkenberg, who ended up in officially 16th position. And I had him up in 13th in my preseason predictions. So not quite where he ended up, a little like 3 positions back, because I was thinking that Haas was going to be a little farther up on the grid overall throughout the season. So not quite where they wanted to be. And of course, my in-season rating was just slightly off, giving him a little bit better ranking than the official one of 15th with a score of 5.98. Now, on the other hand, his teammate, I was kind of completely off because I was thinking that Kevin, coming in for that second season in a row with Haas again, was going to be the leader of that team and be able to actually gel faster and better with that Haas than Nico was going to be. And so I gave him, a prediction of 10th, way off from the 19th position that he ended up in officially. Now, on my in-season rating, I rated him where he ended up in that 20th position. So now this isn't quite the dead last position overall drivers, as we had 2 extra drivers this season, but it did end up dead last to the official drivers at the end of the season with a score of 5.25. Now, why did Kevin not gel as much? I don't know. He did score points on several occasions, but not really where Nico was. I think the big thing here is that Nico was able to gain the 1-lap performance out of the Haas more than Kevin, even though Kevin, I think, could actually make it a little bit better in the race per se on the positions where they started off at. But due to that qualifying position higher in the grid, even though they were both falling back into the grid near the end of the season, Nico would always end up ahead of their teammate, Kevin. And I was just able to just get that little edge over his teammate overall. Now, if we can go over here to this graph, we can kind of see that comparison. So Nico Hülkenberg is in blue and Kevin Magnussen is in red. And if you look at this graph, this is where their ending position for each race. So the lower on this graph they are, the better their positioning is. And of course, right in the middle is that number 10 across this graph, which is where you want to get below to get official drivers standing points. So as we can see here, like Kevin Magnussen was able to get to that 10th position 3 times over the season, whereas Nico Hulkenberg only scored once, but scored quite a bit more points overall in that first running. So he was able to officially jump ahead of his teammate Kevin Magnussen in their rankings. But if you look at overall, I mean, it's a little bit closer match between the two, even though Nico Hulkenberg seems to edge out Kevin Magnussen on general throughout this season. Now we have a couple of trend lines for each driver, and we see that, Kevin Magnussen is going up a little, quicker, a little higher gradient than Nico. Now, if you remember, 20 is bad. 0, 1 is probably good in the sense of where they were going to end up in the finishing position. So we want a downward slope to show the improvement of the drivers, and the upward movement of this trend line is bad. So basically, you can kind of estimate or guess that, Nico Hulkenberg's upward trend was a slower rise, a slower descent in the sense of overall compared to the rest of the field, mainly because the Haas was not getting developed, and so they were falling back into that field. So he's getting more and more out of that Haas, or maybe able to get the most out of the Haas overall compared to his teammate, which is starting to drop near the end of the season. Kind of not quite where they wanted to be in that running. So overall, Nico was doing a much better job, maintaining his position throughout the season, where Kevin was kind of dropping back farther into the field as the season went on, trying to get that Haas to do what he wanted. So that's where you kind of look at this overall. And of course, you say this is on the upper half, so anything below 10 is what matters the most. Anything above 10 really doesn't matter, except for when you're comparing it against your teammate per se, unless you're tied on points for the official standing. So if we go in and then look at Nico Hulkenberg and where he compared to the one driver behind him in the official standings and the person ahead of him in the official standings. So we have Nico Hulkenberg in blue. We have Daniel Ricciardo, which was just behind him with 6 points in 17th position. And you have Valtteri Bottas just ahead of him in that 15th position with 10 points. So Daniel's race here, you can kind of see that because he broke his hand, he dropped off for a few races, and he, of course, didn't start off this season. So you only have a few races to judge him by. So you can kind of take that trend line with a grain of salt for the whole season regarding, even though it looks like he is improving quite a bit throughout this season. So it's kind of harder to judge that line on Daniel Ricciardo because of the few races that he was able to drive during the season to the rest of the field. But you can look at Valtteri Bottas, which was, even though he ended up ahead of Nico Hulkenberg, had a worse trend line than Nico Hulkenberg did. Starting off much better, and then ended up, slowly getting farther and farther behind because that Alfa Romeo was in the same lines as the Haas, where they weren't developing like they wanted to that vehicle. So they started off strong and ended up back. Now, of course, Valtteri has a better history of getting the most out of his car in the sense of Mercedes, and coming into this field had quite a bit of up and downs, because you can see those peaks, and generally the higher peaks usually means something happened in those races where he ended up having a collision or some other kind of incident which dropped him back in the field or dropped him off the end where he couldn't continue the race, depending on how far back and how many other vehicles were involved. So you have to take that in kind of mind with all these loops, as you say, up and down waves on these charts. The ones that are down below are the ones that he got the luckiest or got the best run. I was able to get the most out of that vehicle, where the top ones were generally had some kind of issue, some kind of collision, something that dropped them back farther into the grid to that back of the pack where he couldn't quite make up those ground for the drivers. So, but if you just compare Nico Hulkenberg basically to Valtteri in this first running, they look like they're kind of on par, except for Nico was kind of not quite as good in Monaco and that run than where Valtteri was. It had a few more back of the pack runnings, whereas Valtteri was able to kind of get the most out of that Alfa Romeo during that mid-season running over Nico Hulkenberg. Now, if you look at Daniel Ricciardo, of course, he came out looking a little bit better than Nico, a little bit worse than Valtteri. Had some decent runs and was getting decent runnings out of that Alpha Tauri near the end of this season, but only gaining one race full of points. So you have to take, as I said, you take that with a grain of salt. But during that, you can kind of compare where they lined up with the drivers around them. Now, so if you jump over to Kevin Magnussen and say where he ended up with Guan Yu Zhou and Liam Lawson. So Kevin, of course, is in blue again. And so you can basically see him kind of following that same trend, having a slight increase. So basically not doing quite as well at the end of the season as he was at the beginning of the season, where you see Guan Yu Zhou pretty much a nice flat trend line, which basically he was able to get the same amount of energy out of that Alfa Romeo from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, kind of having that nice steady line across, not really gaining ground, but not really losing ground either, even though through the season where that Alfa was not getting the development. So he was probably learning more about how that vehicle, could be driven throughout this season, gaining those specs, so kind of maintaining that same position throughout the season. And then, of course, you have Liam Lawson, who was, having a really bad trend line here. I think that was mainly because of that fifth race where he kind of didn't do as well, and because of the short number of races, it wasn't pertaining, so he was just not looking as good as he should have. And, of course, you probably can't really rely on that trend line as he only did 5 races throughout this season. But it kind of gives you an idea of where he lined up against Kevin in regards to the yellow line versus the blue line for those 5 races. So how well did the team go? Well, we can see here the points of when they scored and where they scored those points. So you see, Haas starting off fairly decently in those first, 5 races or so, gaining some decent points, and then slowly tailoring off as we go through the season, where Alfa Romeo had a decent start, but was able to maintain those points, and then had a good set of alternate points in Qatar with that 6 points. It gave him the edge over Haas. So basically it's kind of interesting just to see where they gained those points throughout the season, but it's better look at the trend lines overall, so we can see Haas has a worse trend line than Alfa Romeo because of those points that Alfa Romeo was able to get throughout this season. So if we look at a step graph of the two, we can kind of see how they were in the official standings throughout the season. And so basically you have Alfa starting off the season with getting points, so jumping ahead of Haas, but Haas was able to come back fairly quickly and overtake them, and they had a little bit of interchange, and then it looked like Haas was going to win out through that mid-season error. thinking that they were going to be able to maintain those points and maintain that position. But near the end with that Qatar run, had Alpha be able to jump ahead of Haas for that 9th position. So keeping Haas thrown back into that 10th position overall. So what was my thoughts? I think basically that Haas started off really good. That they just need to be able to figure out how to develop that car to either maintain where they are in the season comparative to the rest of the field, or possibly even be able to gain ground a little bit better. I know they're not known for that, so it's kind of hard for them to change that atmosphere in that team to figure out how to get the most out of the in-season development opposed to just all the off-season development. And of course, they came at the end of the season and we're trying to compare the two different floors between the two drivers, as they didn't kind of apply to them as well as they were liked. And so they were kind of comparing those two different, styles, and hopefully they can kind of figure out where to combine those two floors to get the most for both drivers on all of the races to get where they need to be through this off season. And hopefully they haven't developed or spend all the money in the in season so they can actually do some work on the off season to get them back up and to be more competitive for next season. And as for the drivers, I think you basically have Hulkenberg basically taking the lead for Haas. And I think mainly that's because of that one-time lap, getting in those qualifying sessions, as I said, getting up there, even though I think Kevin probably has a little bit better race pace overall. But, getting those positions at the very beginning in that qualifying session, it kind of shows how important that is in regards to, even if you're falling back, Hulkenberg was able to maintain better ending positions over Kevin, even though that gap shrank quite a bit between the qualifying sessions and the end results. So hopefully K-Mag can actually work on that a little bit and get those positions so maybe he can be more competitive with his teammate or overtake Hulkenberg this next season. But in general, I think they still have a lot of work to do in getting the most out of that Haas and having the Haas be able to develop throughout the season. So what is next on the docket? We have how is Alfa Romeo stacking up, as they were the next team on that official ranking. So if you want to see that, I would appreciate a subscribe. And if you made it this far in the video, I'd appreciate a like. Until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.